Chapter 5 Tall Stories. As time went by, Momo became absolutely indispensable to Guido. He developed as deep an affection for the ragged little girl as any footloose, fancy-free young man could have felt for any creature. Making up stories was his ruling passion, as we have already said, and it was in this very respect that he underwent a change of which he himself was fully aware. In the old days, not all of his stories had turned out well. Either he ran short of ideas and was forced to repeat himself, or he borrowed from some movie he'd seen or some newspaper article he read. His stories had plodded along, so to speak, but Momo's friendship had suddenly lent them wings. Most of all, it was when Momo sat listening to him that his imagination blossomed like a meadow in springtime. Children and grown-ups flocked to hear him. He could now tell stories in episodes spanning days or even weeks, and he never ran out of ideas. He listened to himself as enthralled as his audience, never knowing where his imagination would lead him. The next time some tourists visited the amphitheater, Momo was sitting on one of the steps nearby. He began as follows. Ladies and gentlemen, as I am sure you all know, the Empress Harmonica waged countless wars in defense of her realm, which was under constant attack by the goats and hens. Having subdued these barbarian tribes for the up-tenth time, she was so infuriated by their endless troublemaking that she threatened to exterminate them once and for all, unless their king Raokus II made amends by sending her his goldfish. At this period, ladies and gentlemen, goldfish were still unknown in these parts, but Empress Harmonica had heard from a traveler that King Raokus owned a small fish which, when fully grown, would turn into solid gold. The Empress was determined to get her hands on this rare specimen. The Empress, who had imagined goldfish to be smaller, was rather surprised at the creature's size. Never mind, she told herself, the bigger the better. The bigger now, the more gold later on. There wasn't a hint of gold about the fish, not even a glimmer, which worried her until King Raokus' envoy explained that it wouldn't turn into gold until it had stopped growing. Consequently, its growth should not be obstructed in any way. Empress Harmonica pronounced herself satisfied with this explanation. The young fish grew bigger every day, consuming vast quantities of food, but Empress Harmonica was a wealthy woman. It was given as much food as it could put away, so it grew big and fat. Before long, the soup tureen became too small for it. The bigger the better, said the Empress, and had it transferred to her bathtub. Very soon it wouldn't fit into her bathtub either, so it was installed in the imperial swimming pool. Transferring it to the pool was no mean feat, because it now weighed as much as an ox. When one of the slaves carrying it lost his footing, the Empress promptly had the wretched man thrown to the lions, for the fish was now the apple of her eye. Harmonica spent many hours each day sitting beside the swimming pool, watching the creature grow. All she could think of was the gold it would make, because, as I'm sure you know, she led a very luxurious life and could never have enough gold to meet her needs. The bigger, the better, she kept repeating to herself. Those words were proclaimed a national motto and inscribed in letters of bronze on every public building. When even the imperial swimming pool became too cramped, as it eventually did, Harmonica built the edifice whose ruins you see before you, ladies and gentlemen. It was a huge round aquarium filled to the brim with water, and here the whale could at last stretch out in comfort. From now on, the Empress sat watching the great fish all day and night, watching and waiting for the moment when it would turn into gold. She no longer trusted a soul, not even her slaves or relations, and dreaded that the fish might be stolen from her. So here she sat, wasting away with fear and worry, never closing her eyes, forever watching the fish as it blithely splashed around with the least intention of turning into gold. Harmonica neglected her affairs of state more and more, which was just what the goats and hens had been waiting for. Led by King Raucus, they launched one final invasion and conquered the country in no time. They never encountered a single enemy soldier, and the common folk didn't care one way or the other who ruled them. When Empress Harmonica finally heard what had happened, she uttered the well-known words, "If only I'd—" The rest of the sentence is lost in the mist of the time, unfortunately. All we know for sure is that she threw herself into this very aquarium and perished alongside the creature that had blighted her hopes. King Raucus celebrated his victory by ordering the whale to be slaughtered, and the entire population feasted on grilled whale steaks for a week. Which only goes to show, ladies and gentlemen, how unwise it is to believe all you're told. That concluded Guido's lecture. Most of his listeners were profoundly impressed and surveyed the ruined amphitheater with awe. Only one of them was skeptical enough to strike a note of doubt. "When is all this supposed to have happened?" he asked. "I need hardly to remind you," said Guido, who was never at a loss for words, that Empress Harmonica was a contemporary of the celebrated philosopher Nauseus the Elder. Understandably reluctant to admit his total ignorance of when the celebrated philosopher Nauseus the Elder lived, the skeptic merely nodded and said, "Ah, yes, of course." All the other tourists were thoroughly satisfied. Their visit had been well worthwhile, they declared, and no guide had ever presented them with such a graphic and interesting account of ancient times. When Guido modestly held out his peaked cap, they showed themselves correspondingly generous. Even the skeptic dropped a few coins into it. Guido, incidentally, had never told the same story twice since Momo's arrival on the scene. He would have found that far too boring. When Momo was in the audience, a floodgate seemed to open inside him, releasing a torrent of new ideas that bubbled forth without his ever having to think twice. On the contrary, he often had to restrain himself from going too far, as he did the day his services were enlisted by two elderly American ladies whose blood he curdled with the following tale. It is, of course, common knowledge, even in your own fair, freedom-loving land, dear ladies, that the cruel tyrant Maxentius Communis, nicknamed the Red, resolved to mold the world to fit his own ideas. Try as he might, however, he found that people refused to change their ways and remained much the same as they always had been. Towards the end of his life, Maxentius Communis went mad. The ancient world had no psychiatrists capable of curing such mental disorders, as I am sure you know, so the tyrant continued to rave unchecked. He eventually took it into his head to leave the existing world to its own devices and create a brand new world of his own. He therefore decreed the construction of a globe exactly the same size as the old one, complete with perfect replicas of everything in it. Every building and tree, every mountain, river and sea. The entire population of the earth was compelled on pain of death to assist in this vast project. First, they built the base on which the huge new globe would rest. And the remains of that base, dear ladies, are what you now see before you. Then they started to construct the globe itself, a gigantic sphere as big as the earth. Once this sphere had been completed, it was furnished with perfect copies of everything on earth. The sphere used up vast quantities of building materials, of course, and these could be taken only from the earth itself. So the earth got smaller and smaller, while the sphere got bigger and bigger. By the time the new world was finished, every last little scrap of the old world had been carted away. What was more, the whole of mankind had naturally been obliged to move to the new world because the old one was all used up. When it dawned on Maxentius Communis that, despite all his efforts, everything was just as it had been, he buried his head in his toga and tottered off. Where to, no one knows. So you see, ladies, this crater-like depression in the ruins before you used to be the dividing line between the old world and the new. In other words, you must picture everything upside down. The American do-waggers turned pale, and one of them said in a quavering voice, "But what became of Maxentius Communis' world?" "Why, you are standing on it right now," Guido told her. "Our world, ladies, is his." The two old things let out a squeak of terror and took to their heels. Guido's favorite pastime, though, was telling stories to Momo on her own, with no one else around. They were fairy tales mostly, because Momo liked those best, and they were about Momo and Guido themselves. Being intended just for the two of them, they sounded quite different from any of the other stories Guido told. One fine, warm evening, the pair of them were sitting quietly side by side on the topmost tier of stone steps. The first stars were already twinkling in the sky, and a big, silvery moon was climbing above the dark silhouettes of the pine trees. "Will you tell me a story?" Momo asked softly. "All right," said Guido. "What about?" "Best of all, I'd like it to be about us," Momo said. Guido thought a while. Then he said, "What shall we call it?" "How about The Tale of the Magic Mirror?" Guido nodded thoughtfully. "Sounds promising," he said. "Let's see how it turns out." And he puts his arm around Momo and began. Once upon a time there was a beautiful princess named Momo, who dressed in silk and satin and lived high above the world on a snow-clad mountain-top, in a palace built of stained glass. She had everything her heart could desire. Nothing but the choicest food and wine ever passed her lips. She reclined on silken cushions and sat on ivory chairs. She had everything, as I say, but she was all alone. All the people and things around her, her footmen and ladies in waiting, dogs and cats and birds, even her flowers, were merely reflections. The fact was, Princess Momo had a magic mirror, big and round and made of the finest silver. Every day and every night she used to send it out into the world, and the big round mirror soared over land and sea, town and countryside. People who saw it weren't a bit surprised. All they ever said was, "Ah, there is the moon." Well, every time the magic mirror came back to the princess, it would empty out the reflections it had collected on its travels, beautiful and ugly, interesting and dull, as the case might be. The princess picked out the ones she liked best. The others she simply threw into a stream, and quicker than the speed of thought these discarded reflections sped back to their owners along the waterways of the earth. That's why you find your own reflection looking at you whenever you bend over a stream or a pool of water. I forgot to mention that Princess Momo was immortal. Why? Because she'd never seen her own reflection in the magic mirror, and anyone who saw his own reflection in it became mortal at once. Being well aware of this, Princess Momo took care not to do so. She'd always been quite content to live and play with her many other reflections. One day, however, the magic mirror brought her a reflection that appealed to her more than any other. It was the reflection of a young prince. As soon as she saw it, she longed to meet him face to face. How was she to set about it, though? She didn't even know where he lived or who he was. She didn't even know his name. For want of a better idea, she decided to look into the magic mirror after all, thinking that it might carry her own reflection to the prince. There was a chance that he might be looking up the sky when the mirror floated past and would see her in it. Perhaps he would follow the mirror back to the palace and find her there. So she gazed into the mirror, long and hard, and sent it off around the world with her reflection. By doing so, of course, she lost her immortality. Before saying what happened to her next, I must tell you something about the prince. His name was Girolamo, and he ruled a great kingdom of his own creation. This kingdom was situated neither in the present nor in the past, but always one day ahead in the future, which was why it was called Futuria. Everyone who dwelt there loved and admired the prince. "Your Royal Highness," the prince's advisors told him one day, "it's time you got married." The prince had no objection, so Futuria's loveliest young ladies were brought to the palace for him to choose from. They all made themselves look as beautiful as possible, because each of them naturally wanted his choice to fall on her. Among them, however, was a wicked fairy who had managed to sneak into the palace. The blood that ran in her veins was green and cold, not red and warm, but nobody noticed this because she had painted her face so skillfully. When the Prince of Futuria entered the great golden throne room, she quickly muttered such a potent spell that poor Girolamo had eyes for no one but her. He found her so incomparably beautiful that he asked her on the spot if she would be his wife. "With pleasure," hissed the wicked fairy, "but only on one condition." "Name it," the prince said promptly, without a second thought. "Very well," said the wicked fairy, and she smiled so sweetly that the poor prince's head swam. "For 1 whole year you must never look up at the moon in the sky. If you do so, you will instantly lose all your royal possessions. You will forget who you really are and find yourself transported to the land of Presentia, where you will lead the life of a poor, unknown wretch. Do you accept my terms?" "If that's all you ask," cried Prince Girolamo, "what could be easier?" Meanwhile, Princess Momo had been waiting in vain for the prince to appear, so she resolved to venture out into the world and look for him. She let all her reflections go, and, leaving her stained glass palace behind, set off down the snow-clad mountainside in her dainty little slippers. She roamed the world until she came to Presentia, by which time her slippers were worn out and she had to go barefoot, but the magic mirror bearing her reflection continued to soar overhead. One night, while Prince Girolamo was sitting on the roof of his golden palace, playing checkers with the fairy whose blood was cold and green, he felt a little drop of moisture on his hand. "Ah," said the green-blooded fairy, "it's starting to rain." "It can't be," said the prince, "there isn't a cloud in the sky." And he looked up, straight into the big silver mirror soaring overhead, and saw from Princess Momo's reflection that she was weeping and that one of her tears had fallen onto his hand. And at that instant he realized that the fairy had tricked him, that she wasn't beautiful at all and had cold green blood in her veins. His true love, he realized, was Princess Momo. "You have broken your promise," snapped the green-blooded fairy, scowling so hideously that she looked like a snake, "and now you must pay the price." And then, while Prince Girolamo sat there as though paralyzed, she reached inside him with her long green fingers and tied a knot in his heart. Instantly, forgetting that he was the Prince of Futuria, he slunk out of his palace like a thief in the night and wandered far and wide till he came to Presentia, where he took the name Guido and lived a life of poverty and obscurity. All he brought with him was Princess Momo's reflection from the magic mirror, which was blank from then on. By now, Princess Momo had abandoned the ragged remains of her silk and satin gown. She wore a patchwork dress and a man's cast-off jacket, far too big for her, and was living in an ancient ruin. When the two of them met there one fine day, Princess Momo failed to recognize poor good-for-nothing Guido as the Prince of Futuria. Guido didn't recognize her either, because she no longer looked like a princess. But they became companions in misfortune and a source of consolation to each other. One evening, when the magic mirror, now blank, was floating across the sky, Guido took out Momo's reflection and showed it to her. Crumbled and faded though it was, the princess immediately recognized it as her own, the one she'd sent soaring around the world. And then, as she peered more closely at the poor wretch beside her, she saw that he was the long-sought prince for whose sake she had renounced her immortality. She told him the whole story, but Guido sadly shook his head. "Your words mean nothing to me," he said. "There's a knot in my heart, and it stops me remembering." So Princess Momo laid her hand on his breast and untied the knot in his heart with ease. And Prince Girolamo suddenly remembered who he was and where he came from, and he took Princess Momo by the hand and led her far, far away to the distant land of Futuria. They both sat silent for a while when Guido had finished. Then Momo asked, "Did they ever get married?" "I think so, later on," said Guido. "And are they dead now?" "No," Guido said firmly. "I happen to know that for a fact. The magic mirror only made you mortal if you looked into it on your own. If two people looked into it together, it made them immortal again, and that's what those two did." The big silver moon floated high above the dark pine trees, bathing the ruin's ancient stonework in its mysterious light. Momo and Guido sat there side by side, gazing up at it for a long time, and feeling quite certain that, if only for the space of that enchanted moment, the pair of them were immortal.